Okay, good morning, everybody. It's 1 minute past 11, so we should get going. Welcome to today's event, which is the fourth in a 5-part series we are running ahead of the government's Levelling Up white paper, which is currently, I say currently, scheduled for the autumn. We shall see. Each of the events has focused on different aspects of the Levelling Up agenda, and in each we're trying to identify and explore some of the dilemmas or the tensions and the trade-offs that are inevitably associated with the Levelling Up agenda, but largely get ignored, particularly when people are talking about it from government. And the focus today is on delivering Levelling Up. And in particular, we want to explore some of those issues in relation to the respective roles of central government and local government and mayors, since how all this plays out and who's delivering what and who should be delivering what and who should be in the lead. And we've got three great speakers to take us through these issues, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But as always, a few words of housekeeping. So the event is being recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. During the event, your microphones will be kept on mute. The hashtag for the event is Levelling Up Dilemma. There's opportunities to ask questions of our three great speakers. You can post them at any time in the chat function using the channel Ask a Question. Post it in there, and when we get to the Q&A after we've heard from our three speakers, we'll go through them. When we get to our questions, if time allows and you're of that persuasion, we'd like you to ask your question, so be prepared. If not, then I'll do that for you, and we'll be done by 12 o'clock. So that's the housekeeping rules and regs. Let me introduce our speakers. So our first speaker is going to be Jill Rutter. Jill is a senior research fellow at the UK Interchanging Europe. She's also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Government and a formal civil servant in Treasury and in Number 10. Following Jill will be Mark Sandford. Mark is a senior research analyst at the House of Commons Library and knows more about local government than nearly all of us on the call, I'm pretty certain. And our third speaker is Joanne Roney. Joanne is the Chief Executive of Manchester City Council and is very much in the vanguard of the devolution agenda in England. So each of them will speak to us for 5 or so minutes, setting out their stall on these issues, who should be in charge and what the respective roles are. And then we'll get into questions and answers. So without further ado, Jill, over to you.
Hey, thanks very much, Andrew. And I'm actually not going to ask the question of who is going to be in charge. That I think is for others, but what I'm going to do is talk through what some of the sort of decisions are that need to be made in government. Andrew mentioned that I'd worked at the Treasury and Number 10. He didn't mention I'd worked on local government and Department of the Environment, including on the poll tax. But actually, I also worked in DEFRA. And one of the things I did there is I was Director of Strategy and Sustainable Development. And some features of the Levelling Up agenda bears some of the hallmarks of sustainability in the 2000s, most notably that every government department said it was committed to sustainable development. They all had their own take on sustainable development. They used the word sustainable in almost every publication they put out, but it became so devalued that it was almost meaningless. And you would see, we're doing sustainable development. We're just emphasizing this bit of sustainable development. Choose from vacuous definition and put your thing out there. I have to say that the Department of Community and Local Government, as then was a particular offender in everything was about a sustainable this or a sustainable that. I think one of the real risks is that levelling up goes the same way as sustainable development, that it becomes a slogan, and you'll find that absolutely everybody says our policies are part of the government's levelling up programme. And I think the acid test for any of these things, if you are a government committed to levelling up, is to answer the question of, so what are you doing that is different because you're a government committed to levelling up compared to a government that wasn't committed to levelling up? So where actually is, if you like, the rubber hitting the road on this, and something is going to be different. Now, if you want to answer the question of what's different, you need to know, what are you trying to do? And I think, talking to Andrew, this has been quite a repetitive theme, that at the moment, levelling up is something everybody can buy into, because nobody has said levelling up is this and it's not that. So if I was a civil servant tasked, and I'm quite glad I'm not, with writing the levelling up white paper, my first question would be, well, actually, what are going to be the areas we're targeting? Is it just about economic performance? Is it about dealing with that very variable level of regional productivity, and in particular tackling the sort of long tail of poor productivity? Yeah. There is a question within that. Are we focused particularly on bringing the northern cities up to the level of London, or are we focused on the particularly trailing areas and things like that? This is, things. But is it really just about productivity? Is it about something else? Is it actually about public service provision? Is it about spending? We've had lots of complaints that spending is very slanted towards richer areas. Is it about services? Is it about, actually what do you get out of education? Is it about service performance? Is it about inputs? Is it about outputs? Is it about infrastructure? We've heard a lot talking about levelling up in terms of the relative underinvestment in connectivity and the poor performance of things like rail in the north compared to the south. But actually, the Prime Minister, in his speech on levelling up, which I thought was most notable for the huge disclaimer, number 10, wrote across the top that this was exactly as delivered by the Prime Minister, in case anyone had any doubts and thought this was really a version produced by officials. That's just a snarky aside. Does it go wider? Is it actually about quality of life? Is it about giving people places to live that they actually like? They may be relatively unproductive, but they might just be a bunch nicer. One of the things when I was at DEFRA, we were always frustrated about was we always wanted our grand metrics about climate change, things like that. Public opinion surveys said that what people really cared about was litter, dog mess, things like that, the stuff that actually intrudes on your quality of life on a day-to-day basis. Is it about any of that? So I think that is the first set of questions that the government has to do that. Because the risk is that the government says, and every department says, well, of course it's that, it's all of the above. And the trouble is, if something is all of the above, it rapidly becomes none of the above, because actually you just go on slapping a levelling up label on stuff you're doing. You've got a bunch of other questions, and my colleagues at Institute for Government are about to produce a thing on questions. One of the big questions is it about people or is it about places? We know that actually you can, on some measures, say that there is huge amounts of deprivation within London, even though London is clearly not a place that you think needs levelling up. So is it within or is it between? I think is one of the very big decides. I think one of the things I would take out of the government thing is that it's more a between areas, and it is quite place-based, but who does it know? The quickest thing the government can do, and this is the thing only the central government can really do, is reallocate spending. And if that's what you want to do, then actually who is going to deliver that has to be the Treasury through the spending round in conjunction with departments that says, we are distributing spending differently to what a non-levelling up government would have done. There are then big questions, well, I'm sure we'll get onto that when Joanne speaks, about who actually gets to decide what is done with that money. This is a government that seems to me to like to hold on to the purse strings and has quite a non-discretionary approach. So you will come to us, we will get to decide whether you get a pot of money. And if you would like to put a central government flag on it, particularly if you're a devolved administration, we will be super happy with that. That might indeed come with quite a lot of strings attached. One of the big questions is it just about capital or is it about revenue spending? Much more painful in many ways to make it about revenue spending, because that's much more of a zero-sum game, particularly after the settlement we've just seen on health, which means there's not much money for anything else. But you can do that relatively quickly. But there are some horrible consequences if you take money away from people. One of the big questions, I think, is what's the difference between substantive and what you might call performative measures? I think some of the performative measures, the totemic measures, may do quite a lot for people saying, well, actually, this is a government that knows we exist and pays attention. But, how transformational really is it to ship a bunch of civil servants to Wolverhampton or to Darlington? Maybe a bit, but it's going to be quite a long run before that has any substantive stuff. So I think the government needs to decide How much is it doing real stuff that's going to take a long time to deliver versus some signaling stuff which may be important in the short run? Anything based on outcomes going to take you a long time to deliver. So the big question for me is how much discretion? What do? You can do stuff with mayors if you're prepared to. Andy Street, Ben Houchin, yes. Andy, not so sure. But we can do stuff with mayors. What about places that don't have mayors? There's quite a lot of levelling up needed in some of these sort of places that really, really are very, very left behind, but don't. And are you prepared to go to sub-mayoral level? Really interesting report today from Onward think tank that actually said, actually the Labour government's New Deal for Communities looked as though by going to that really, really local level, they actually did deliver something that you could say looked a bit like levelling up if you at least define it as improving quality of life in some pockets of extreme deprivation. So, and I think the big question for me is that in any area, I know that Michael Bishar, who was very briefly director of the Institute for Government, did a thing called Total Place. We still have this very messy patchwork of providers with different accountability chains, run at different levels, getting money through different things, working to different things. I think one of the big things is there actually any view of who can act as a convener to make all these things make sense in the places that we care about? I'm going to stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Jill. Absolutely loads in that for us to come back to and just explore in a bit more detail. Some similarities, what we've heard in other events, but some differences as well, which is good. Mark, let's turn to you and get your sort of reflections on, the nature of the debate and the dilemmas associated with delivering levelling up. Mark.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you for the introduction, very kind introduction earlier on. I'm going to cover some of the same ground that Jill has covered already, I think, but from a slightly different perspective. I'm going to just mention 3 or perhaps 2.5 tensions and trade-offs associated with levelling up. And I don't have the benefit, unlike the other 2 speakers, of having ever had to actually do any of this stuff. I've spent my entire career reading and writing about it, so that would inevitably colour what I say. But I'm going to make 3 brief points, which I think are all actually perennial issues about governance generally, but they become particularly important when large aspirations like levelling up appear. And I'm going to have a go at providing some very quick, very partial answers to the dilemmas that they represent. So first, I wanted to note the very obvious trade-off between central control and local discretion around the levelling up agenda. If levelling up is going to be successful, whatever we actually mean by that, the chances are that that will be helped by local governments' knowledge and capacity around their local areas, and that will be able to make a greater contribution the more decision-making discretion local governments have. But this, of course, runs up against a perennial Whitehall concern, which was expressed to a colleague of mine as a civil servant who literally said, what happens if we give power to these people and they don't do what we want? Now, I'm sure everybody on this call is aware of that tension. It's been present for at least 50 years, probably more, reflects a deeply held, stronger or weaker belief amongst the civil service that localities cannot be trusted. I think that was particularly exposed in the depth of COVID last year, but it's been around for a long time. Now, it's clear that government has some awareness that this tension exists, and you can see with the recent bid-based funds that Jill alluded to, the Levelling Up Fund, the Community Renewal Fund, and things like the Towns Fund and Future High Street Fund as well. They all have attempts within them to square this circle, to effectively say to local areas, get yourselves a partnership together, work together, decide what you want to do, and if we like it, we'll give you the money to do it. And I think that is intended to be a neat way of appearing to be devolving power and responsibility, whilst also permitting the UK government a route to taking the political credit for anything that actually gets done. And that's quite a strong point, obviously always a strong point for central government, but it's a particularly strong point at the moment of this government, I think, in the wake of Brexit and in the rise of this government stance of muscular unionism. And I think also there's a dimension of this is something that Anand Menon remarked on in a blog a few months ago, where he said, he alluded to how little governing has been done in the last 5 years by governments of whatever shade. And I think the idea that the UK government can do stuff to make life better for people everywhere in the UK is obviously a very popular idea for governments and electorates alike. So it's not surprising that governments would want to take the credit for doing that. Now, what's the solution to this dilemma? Well, as with any dilemma, there's always going to be a balance between the two sides of it. If more power is devolved for decision-making to local authorities, there'll be less capacity for the government to prescribe exactly what happens. But actually, there are a number of ways in which the government has shown that in practice it can let things go. I recently found out that, for instance, the first gateway reviews of the Metro Mayor's investment funds, which were due to be done, I think, this year or last year, they've been concluded, and they've been fairly light touch. And the government has been content to assess conformance and not to get involved in telling Metro Mayors what they should have done with that money. Greater London Authority, London has had sort of similar treatment for several years. There was something which was once called the financial settlement for London, and the government's been happy to allow Metro Mayors to have single pots, bringing together a number of their funding streams. So there are loopholes and there are freedoms that exist in the system already. They're just not easy to see. And I think more practically, it has to be accepted that if you have 9 or 19 or 40 Metro Mayors in existence, by the law of averages, sooner or later one of them is going to mess up in some way. What's important is that a protocol exists for what happens when things do go wrong, and that's generally accepted by both sides. So that's the first tension. Second tension, I think, again, this is one that Jill has alluded to, but it's a tension between the capital infrastructure approach and what I think can be characterized as the kind of social infrastructure stroke foundational economy approach. Put simply, which of these is levelling up about, or in what's the balance between them? So those big funds, the Towns Fund and the like, the Levelling Up Fund, they're largely about infrastructure, skills, regeneration. And of course, as Jill was saying, that report from Onward made the point that that's not necessarily the most important thing when it comes to levelling up communities. I think it's interesting in this regard that Metro Mayors in their first few years have spent quite a bit of energy addressing what I call orphan policies, which are policy areas that are not clearly the responsibility of any one tier of government. So things like mental health, climate change, air quality, employment practices, rehabilitation of offenders. And there's clearly structural dimensions to this, because those tend to be low-cost interventions, and Metro Mayors don't have much power or money to do much else. But perhaps those are effective. Perhaps those type of interventions punch above their weight when it comes to actually having a levelling up style effect on local areas. I don't know, but it's an interesting tension within it. And again, there's some awareness of this within the government. So you can see these kinds of policy areas popping up in the prospectus for the Community Renewal Fund, for instance. But I don't think that that tension has attracted a great deal of debate within the context of levelling up generally. And there is an elephant in the room here, I think, and that is public services. I think it's quite telling that a number of those orphan policies that I alluded to just now amount to initiatives to plug gaps in public services. And this is, I don't think this is something that has really appeared at all within the levelling up debate, but there are clearly huge linkages there. Insofar as it's possible to solve this issue, I think you can only go back to the question of what is levelling up for? How do we know success when we see it? Without that, of course, the risk is that a lot of projects are delivered and a few years later, somebody turns around and said, well, that's not what we wanted. And then what do we do then? So that is a tension which I think will become clearer as time goes on. I'll just finish with something that's dear to my heart. I know everybody else finds this very boring, but it's issues around fiscal devolution. Long-standing trade-off between fiscal devolution, the ability to raise your own money locally for local governments, and transfer grants. And it obviously links into the question of if local areas are given grants by governments to do things, how far should the government be able to tell them what to do? And in the recent past, that has frequently been resolved in favour of central government holding the strings quite tightly. And that's led to the question for many local authorities, well, let's think about, if we want more freedom of action, can we have greater capacity to raise funding locally in order to do it? And in my view, there's no final solution to this tension. There's always going to be a need for balance. And I think that's an important point to make in this context, because fiscal devolution shouldn't be seen as a panacea, not least because if a place needs levelling up, it probably will have, by definition, less capacity to raise funding locally anyway. And I think that grant funding is an unavoidable part of any levelling up programme. So those are the three critical trade-offs around levelling up, I think. And it's important to say that whatever policy we do end up with will take a position on each of them. It can't avoid taking a position. The question is whether that will be a considered position, actively taken position, or whether it will arise by default. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Three great issues to explore, and your final point about whether we will get explicit positions taken on some of those issues or whether it will just emerge, I think is a really important point to hold on to. Joanne, you've most definitely been doing this stuff for a very long time, if you don't mind me saying so. You've been in Manchester now, in part of the devolution vanguard. Just say a little bit about your perspectives on this issue about who should be in control and levelling up.
Okay, so here's some views from me. So first thing about levelling up white paper. I'm hoping it isn't a slogan that ends up with everything being ticked into it and branded as such. I think that would be a real mistake. But the other side of that is I actually don't want it to be narrow and prescriptive. So I guess I'm in a place that says, let it be clear on the scale of the challenge. And as Jill said, what is it we're trying to address here? But then let it be open enough for areas, places to come forward with the answers devised locally with whatever arrangements fit them. So second point for me is I don't think we should default into a north and south issue or a red walls issue. I think there is a challenge around productivity, and there is a challenge around quality of life in a range of different places, and so it should be something that reads across for UK as a whole, and it'd be a mistake if it gets kind of bracketed, siloed in some other way. Having said that, of course, there are some straightforward issues that do need levelling up about current funding. I'm thinking R&D spend, I'm thinking something around culture grants, and I'm thinking particularly around transport. And so I think that there has to be some honesty here about an element of levelling up, which isn't about taking money away from some areas, but is about acknowledging an investment, a higher level investment in some other places at scale for those big changes, particularly R&D and transport for me. So I think levelling up is about improving life chances for people, and I think it's about improving local productivity, regional productivity. And I think COVID has kind of laid bare the scale of inequalities that exist in all of our places. And I think people will want to see, as we move through to the next phase of contain and COVID and living with COVID, people will want to see clear narratives around improving health and well-being of our places, addressing skills gaps, but also about creating good employment. I think there's a real issue here around what type of employment going forwards. I think infrastructure has to be a major part of levelling up, but I think the point that Mark was making, and I think Jill made earlier really, those quality of life outcomes for people are revenue-based funding. So there has to be something in here about public sector reform and getting outcomes for people that aren't just about long-term infrastructure. So a blueprint for our places is what I'm looking for. So let me get into GM and the city and the towns that make up GM. And as you say quite rightly, we're a mature group of people who have worked through well, we mainly work through collaboratively and collegiately, and they're clear about what we do at a GM level and what we do at a locality level. These are conversations that return to frequently. So as quick as the Devo deal's done, we're back into implementing that Devo deal and thinking how we do it. So what do I want to see levelling up as part of that? Well, we don't see it as a continuation of GM as is. And neither do we see as here's a Greater Manchester blueprint that should be put kind of imposed in anywhere else. We absolutely don't think that. What works for Greater Manchester is for Greater Manchester. It's for other places to come forward with what they see. But we think there are two elements. Firstly, the continuation of devolution of powers. And I absolutely agree with what Mark said. That goes hand in hand with a rethink on autonomy and accountability. And so we've been thinking through here, well, what is it that we think the mayor should be accountable to government for, and in what way? And I think we'd be up for a conversation on the next wave of levelling up, being a little clearer about what we would be doing at GM level and how we're accountable for that, as well as a recognition that towns and cities in Greater Manchester also want an element of getting on and doing what needs to be done in their places. And we can work that out. Of course, we're the only place that's got health and social care devolved to us. And I think that's it's been an interesting dynamic to think about what the arrangements we've got and how they will fit into an ICS framework. So there's a maturity, I think, that we have in GM that says, look, we really could work this through in a bit more difference, a bit different how it is now, but a bit more detail. Because I think we are clear about our respective roles and our respective networks. So what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for a strengthening of accountability to go hand in hand with longer term infrastructure commitments on housing, digital, low carbon, but massive transport. We call it the London style transport system for GM, which is an integrated longer term transport plan that we will deliver for government in partnership with government, or certainly accountable back on some of that funding. We're looking for the creation of the ICS to pick up the elements of public sector reform as we fully integrate our health and social care systems here. Now, we have a strong track record of people-centred service delivery and reforming public sector reform, and we would want to carry on integrating health and social care, but with that person-centred approach to it. A very simple test here. Irrespective of where you work in the system, we want you to be able to do what's right for the person in front of you and not have individuals passed around. So we want a workforce that's empowered here in GM, a well-regarded, well-paid, well-resourced workforce. And the reason we're unashamedly talking about health and social care and public sector reform alongside our levelling up ask is that we know from the work we've done with Professor Michael Marmot that 30% of the productivity gap in GM could be reduced by tackling ill health, doing the work that we've been doing around prevention, alongside the work we do through the devolved skills that we've got. Now, we have the evidence for that, and I think we haven't touched on that as speakers yet, but that point around accountability and levelling up, I think does lead to saying where you can evidence that we can make a difference, through the work that we've done, then we need to do more of that. And we need to be not just asking for powers and devolution, but we need to be absolutely clear that we have an evidence base that justifies that ask. For us, it's about understanding the labour market churn that's going on at the moment. We've got a lot of jobs lost as a result of COVID in different sectors, but we've got new skills and new jobs being created. So the more we've done on boot camps, on digital boot camps, on housing retrofit, the more we can do to power up skills funding, the better for us to try and get us in front of that kind of new economy that's coming. So we're pretty clear about our ask at GM and what we'll be looking for in levelling up. Integrated transport system, as I've said, at a GM level, mayor accountability for it, mayoral accountability around a greater scale of influence over post-16 education and the skills system, building on what we already know works. We'd like to see more integration with government around things like local JCP teams, so that we are in a shared space around what we're doing to tackle the productivity gap. But we also want to think through long-term shared prosperity fund issues around place-based planning to stop the silos. If I turn to my own city, I've got North Manchester, most deprived part of the city, despite the city's success. We've got proposals for 15,000 new homes being built there and new hospitals built there. But what we've been talking about is that this ask to transform the north of Manchester doesn't stop with the boundary of Manchester. This goes to Middleton, this goes to Bury, this goes to Rochdale. So how are we thinking about our places and the connectivity between our places, and not just bringing forward proposals that are local authority boundary areas, but even though this may be something that's delivered by the city, the benefit, the understanding, the reach of this goes much, much wider than my boundary. I said at the start that we were looking for some specifics around a change of major government investment, particularly around R&D. Yeah. So our next ask on levelling up will be a real recognition that where you have a city like Manchester that's got a global reach, and those who may have missed it, we have just been voted the 3rd best city in the world, and our global reach is something that we want to build on for UK prosperity, not just local prosperity. But to do that, we need levelling up to enable us to have, we're calling them, it's called Innovate GM, which is the creation of innovation hubs across GM that starts to build that global capacity, the reach of our universities on life sciences, advanced materials, net carbon, really building high quality skills, connectivity across the whole of GM. Yep. And of course, place-based regeneration. Let me be clear, I'm talking about long-term, thought through, held to account strategies that are around changing our economy and outcomes for people. But I also recognise short-term investments into some of our towns that do quick wins and kickstart the rethinking, the reshaping of some of our other areas is equally important. So the work that not Stockport have done and other places to make that connectivity. So connected, responsive, productive, people focused as well as place focused, but absolutely it's got to have some element of public sector reform so that we get the best out of the revenue that is already being spent in our places to support that agenda. Fantastic. And that's what we're about doing in GM.
Thank you, Jo, very much indeed, reminding us indeed of the mature relationships that you, a very good word to use, I think, in terms of that. I think so lots in there, and I had some questions, but post your questions in the chat function for Jill, Mark, and Joan. We'll get to them. And we could take this in lots of different ways, but I'm interested in, Jill, I'll come back to you initially because Mark raised this issue, and then I get Joe's reflection on this about the trust question, which is partly related to competency, I think. Between government, central and local, long-standing, as Mark said. I mean, just how prominent or how significant is that at the minute, do you think, in terms of progressing the levelling up? Do you think there's a shift in the way central government trusts or thinks about competency in local government, or is that just, that's just part and parcel of what we've seen over many decades? And I get Joe to say something about, how GM is maybe trying to deal with that if it's a problem. Jill.
Yeah, I'm probably stronger on trust in the past rather than trust now. So I might look to Joanne and Mark to talk about now. The perception in central government has in the past been that people out there don't really understand who is responsible for what. And I think one of the reasons that George Osborne was so keen on making accountable, visible mayors part of that sort of devolution deal, you would only get the money and the powers if you were prepared to also have a single figure who people could relate to and understand was accountable. Was partly the perception in central government that you could write the checks from central government, you could do things, but actually if services went wrong or things were going badly, people did not understand what was done locally. Particularly, they would come back to you, it would rebound to you, you would end up answering questions. And I think one of the things that the mayoral agenda has done is create more visible local accountability. The downside, of course, for government in that, so I think that means that you can say, we gave you the money, what have you done with it? That's one question. The downside, and I think this has been a dilemma through not just Boris Johnson, it was clearly one reason why Theresa May went cold on the mayoral agenda, was the perception that because mayoralties tend to be much more in Labour fiefdoms with some notable exceptions, that you're actually giving people locally huge amounts of credit for what they do, and that effectively you may have a relatively enfeebled opposition, but you can have a demonstration of effective local politics that we can point to and say, well, look at what X has done in Y, and that you're creating a political weapon for your opponents to use. So if only we were in power like we are in blank, look what we could do, even though central government perceive it providing the money. So I think that actually is probably as much of a problem as trust in the areas that you deem to be big and capable. We do know, though, and it's one of the things that, Manchester is on the far end of having the capacity of doing this stuff. Other areas are nowhere near as mature as Joanne and colleagues. So I do think there is a bit of worry about, will actually this stuff be done properly well? And will you have a productive relationship with central government, or will it end up being sort of blame games and things like that? That's another thing. When I was doing local government finance, our big problem were the big Tory shire councils who didn't buy into the government's agenda at all. I mean, that's why we ended up with sort of nightmares that we went into through the 1980s of trying to rein them in, because they were perceived to be completely off the then agenda. So it's not just a sort of control thing, but I think it's the politics of it is as difficult as the accountability in many ways.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Joe, come back to you. I mean, do you get a sense that this is it's a challenge? And if it is, what are the way, you talked a little bit about offering sort of almost enhanced accountability to try and, to satisfy current government concerns, but is it a problem? And is that the way you see maybe trying to square the circle that Mark was highlighting?
So I'm not sure I describe it as a problem, but I think clarity is needed about responsibility is levelling up. Let's just look at GM here. It's had stable leadership for many years. It's worked at its partnership for 10 years plus longer. It's taken time to get kind of in a place where it knows what it's doing, and it's clear about where the demarcation lines are and who does what at what level. And I think it's got two elements to it. One is we're evidence-led in GM. We are evidence-led. We commission work, independent economic prosperity reviews, Marmot city region work. We have very strong partnerships with business. So in many ways, we have a foundation there from which you build to get the right decisions and the right delivery. That, as you say, doesn't exist everywhere. So that's what I'm saying. People couldn't just say, well, tell us what GM do and we want a slice of that here. You've got to put those foundations in place. But I do think the government have got to work through what they're expecting people to do. And we're clear here that levelling up for us is the things I've mentioned previously. We accept there may be a need for some accountability back to government in some of that, and more importantly, credit where credit's due, actually. And if we get what we're asking for from government, then that's credit to them that they get it. Government have got mayors, potentially more mayors, if not mayors' county deals or some other forums, and they have got to work out how they're going to have that accountability play out in different places.
That's a great point. Great point. Mark, kind of zooming back out, in the sense that we can debate what, that's the sort of shape and nature of the devolution that we've had in England, very deal-based for a bunch of reasons. But moving forward, this point about very different capacity in different parts of the country, which probably then worries government in terms of delivery and competence, I would suggest. I mean, how do you see that playing out in terms of, devolution being more broadly pushed across more parts? Will the government be accepting of that kind of variation in capacity or not? What's your best guesses on that?
I think it's kind of an unavoidable part of the agenda, and I think you see it already in the metro mayoralties that already exist. I mean, Greater Manchester, we all know, is an outlier in many respects in this agenda. If you look at places like Tees Valley or Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, we hear a lot about Tees Valley because of Ben Houchin, but they're very small organisations. They're 100 or fewer staff in each of those, I understand. And in fact, there was an interview with Ben Houchin somewhere that I read a few weeks ago where he said, that if I'm going to take on more powers, I need to do it slowly, because if we tried to take over health and social care tomorrow, the organisation would just fall over. It couldn't cope because the capacity isn't there. I would say generally, I think both central and local government perhaps need to recognise more clearly that capacity is part of the issue, and building it up takes time. And Joe alluded to the practice from previous rounds of devolution deals where people from places which don't have devolution would almost literally turn up and say, well, Manchester's got A, B, and C, so we'd like that, please. And that's it. And that, even if there was a business plan to back that up, there then needs to be an organisational structure to deliver it. And in fact, I don't know how many people on the call will have seen the evaluation of devolved institutions that was published in about May. It was very, very, very soft launch, but this was a point that it made quite early on, and saying that actually in the first term of the elected mayors that we've got, a lot of time was spent conforming to legal requirements and just building up the capacity to be in business and do what they were literally legally required to do, as much as actually deliver any outcomes. So those things do take time, and that's a problem for a policy area where government's interest in it does ebb and flow.
Yes, no, that's a good point. I'm picking up on that. I mean, the polling work that we've had done, I've seen other polling, from different organizations, all seems to suggest that the public in general are in favor of more powers and responsibilities and the ability to flex activity, to be in their area, to be more flexible for their area, to be more empowered over those areas. That's fairly good. I mean, and when we did it, it was 80% of the public in the metro mayor areas were in favor of more devolution to their metro mayors. And yet, government kind of treads carefully in that sort of space. I mean, how do you see that playing out, Jill? Do you think ultimately, that public pressure becomes, a significant factor? I mean, government's talked a lot about now leveling up? I mean, people are to varying degrees aware of the term, even if they don't fully know what government means by it. Is that a double-edged sword in the end of it, in the sense that once you raise awareness of something, you have to deliver on it? And is that the way we get, we get progress in this space?
Well, I think that's one of the worries about why the government's so far failed to put any sort of substantive metrics about it, because the more you define that this is what you can expect from levelling up, then the more you create a rod for your own back if you fail to deliver it. But, one of the things that's happened is Prime Minister set up a delivery unit in Downing Street. Impossible to have that sort of Barber-esque model of delivery unless you know what you're trying to do. I mean, just to say, go and make sure levelling up is happening. You can't do that as a bunch of bureaucrats sitting there unless you've got to say, well, what are you trying to achieve? So I do think they're going to have to put a bit more definition around it. One of my questions actually, maybe to Mark and to Joanne, is whether really, if we do want much more extensive devolution and bring it into some of the sort of things which compared to Greater Manchester would be regarded as subscale, but where there isn't a sensible geography that people would identify with. Greater Manchester sort of works because it's quite a logical sort of unit, but a lot of other areas don't work at the sort of necessary scale. Whether there is a way of avoiding what, as a former Treasury official, I would regard as a bit of a deadweight cost, which was recreating pockets of little capacity all over the place. And is there a way in which we can mesh the sort of local choice, local decisions, local, flexing for this is what this works for us, with the sort of backroom capacity to create and deliver and stuff like that? Because it's the front end I'm interested in. I'm interested in this works for my area. I'm not so interested in how it happens. But if you do that, it seems to me you're imposing such a big cost penalty on it that you're reducing the capacity to actually get stuff out to the sort of front line and where you actually want things.
No, that's
happening.
a very good point.
That's one of the things that people need to look at.
Joe, I'll come back to Mark on the public perception and public pressure question, but just pick up on that. Obviously, you're in GM. You think about GM. You're doing GM, but taking yourself out of that. I mean, this issue about other places that maybe have less of a coherence, less of a maturity of approach, less of an understanding kind of economic geography, which GM clearly does as well. I mean, what are your kind of reflections on that for the broader devolution, public services reform agenda? And you're on mute at the minute. Do you need? That's it.
Okay, so I think there's 3 areas that any place could co-join with neighbouring authorities or other places to start to think through what a devolved structure could do. One is skills, and through the skills board and the skills white paper, I think there's a great opportunity there to set your skills partnerships up with DWP locally to really get your analysis of your labour market and to work with business about future skills pathways. So I think that's one that all places could move on and stop duplicating conversations and capacity and to rethink it. I think the other one is investment silos. The big push we've got is around one of the great successes for GM was a revolving housing investment fund to tackle brownfield, but again working with a partnership with Homes England and to start to think differently about flex around existing investment pots and again building that capacity at once in an organisation that can do housing planning, housing investment, place-based strategies and planning reform. A great opportunity there. And the other one would be public sector reform. I think most places have, through COVID, worked differently on their public health teams, have worked differently around with their GPs, with their we've got Afghan resettlement Arab programs going on. So that kind of public sector collaboration space, again, through a devolution deal, could start to drive out more capacity or build the capacity once in a place and share it more broadly. And we do that in GM. And of course, the other one we do at a GM level, which has been crucial for the past 2 years, is emergency planning. We pooled all our emergency planning alongside local police force. and we have a GM-wide instant response to any emergency, which means we've been able to deploy resources as and where they were needed. Now, these are things that you could start with very easy anywhere in the UK and build up your partnerships, your relationships, you're working from those.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. It's one of the reasons, broadly, I've always been in favour of the deal-based approach that we've had thus far, even though I accept all the criticisms, because you're trying to deal with this appetite and capacity, and it's not equally spread across the country. So go into those places where those things are initially aligned, and then working out from them into other areas, I think is at least I can see the merits of that. Mark, come in on this issue as well, but I wanted to get just your a reflection from you on, public appetite, public pressure, public expectations of, leveling up on the one hand, devolution on the other, seem to be in front of politicians in many respects, particularly central government politicians. Do you think ultimately that's where some of this gets resolved, because the politicians at the national level have to respond to, or do you think they can largely, ride that out?
Going to be cynical here and say they can largely ride it out.
Good. Nothing wrong being cynical.
One of the things that a lot of the things that I do in my day job involve responding to queries from members about this stuff, and there isn't much interest in the finer details of metro mayors. I know that some members, I don't think it's really in the public domain, but members have in the past sort of rounds of devolution got involved in local debates and tried to discourage certain proposals. I'm not saying they discourage devolution in general, but they've discouraged certain proposals on certain boundaries from being proceeded with. I think also you have to bear in mind that wanting devolution of power is very much a sort of it's both a motherhood and apple pie thing, and it's a socially acceptable response to any survey. Very few people are going to say, yeah, actually I want the central government to do everything. And alongside that, you don't have to dig too far into things like the local media to find a real hatred of councils. Even if it's a casual, it all falls out hatred, it's there, and that kind of thing will come through to members and ministers as well. Every member will have had in their post bag dozens of constituency issues where the council has fouled up in some way and they've had to come in and try and sort it out. So I don't think that is a deal breaker by a long shot, no.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. So we've got about 5 minutes left. Joe, I want to start with you. Again, I will be undoubtedly wrong. I usually am. But my reading of the white paper as it currently is that it will have, it will have references to and talk about devolution, but it will primarily be about bringing other places up to the level, whatever that means, up to the level of the MCAs as they currently exist, i.e., it's everywhere else getting something and we hold the MCAs fairly constant. Is that your reading of it? And if that is true, what might we do to, in the few months that we've got left, how might we influence them to reconsider it and in a sense go further on, some of the things that you were alluding to that you wanted to see in GM? Have I got it wrong? I probably have, but what's your take on where we will get to with the white paper in the autumn?
So I don't think it's that narrow, Andrew.
Good.
That it will kind of debar those existing mayors or those existing areas who have got an evidence-based rationale for more to not come forward with more. Whether there's the capacity in government to do that, I don't know, because quite rightly, and if there are county deals and other mayorals coming forward, I would expect the capacity to go to those areas in the first phase. The answer to your question, though, for me is, and it's one that Andy and I have discussed, Andy Burnham and myself have discussed, is in order for GM to do more, we have to be explicit that this is about us doing more to deliver on the government's agenda. And whether we do that as a city of Manchester who has a track record of delivery and is in a good place, or whether it's done at GM level. But for us, it's net zero, and it's massive change in transport connectivity, which will be the levelling up in GM. And if we say to government, it's not us asking for more powers or more for us for the sake of it. It's about UK PLC productivity. Levelling up means you need places like Greater Manchester to deliver. We've got the capacity, we can do it, but it's delivering on the government's ambition of levelling up in transport, levelling up in R&D and global, but also levelling up on net zero. And that's where we'll be.
Yeah, and those kind of ambitions be sort of differences at the margins, but in the broad sense, achieving net zero, revolutionizing the way that the transport system works. I mean, those are commonly held ambitions that you would have, and government would have, for a whole bunch of different reasons. Mark, you're kind of tell me that my reading of the white paper is wrong. I'm very happy that Joanne tells me I'm misplaced on that, and just your kind of general thoughts of where you think we'll get to in the autumn with the white paper on devolution.
Very hard to read from my point of view. I think that it's recent answers to parliamentary questions have sort of downplayed expectations, mentioned devolution, but really majored on levelling up. There was a report in the FT yesterday where apparently Robert Jenrick said devolution was not about giving more money to mayors, which kind of worried me a bit, because I thought, well, what are they going to have if they're not going to have money? But I think that there does seem to be an interest in establishing more institutions. How much power they'll initially have, I don't know, but I'd be reasonably optimistic that any new metro mayors will have the sort of same suite of powers, if I can put it that way, that's been available so far. You saw this in the North of Tyne and West Yorkshire deals, which are the most recent two, that yet again, whole chunks of text are being lifted out of the first round of devolution deals and being recycled. So that obviously wasn't a problem. The idea that there wasn't the need for another debate about whether or not the adult education budget should be made available to West Yorkshire.
Yes.
So I'm optimistic that those kind of the existing range of powers will probably be rolled forward if places like Lincolnshire or Cumbria or Suffolk or Notts and Derbyshire, wherever it is, are successful in their bids. Beyond that, I really have no intelligence on whether further items are within scope, and I just don't know, and I wouldn't bet on it, because I've seen not even a denial that they are from the government. So I think if those debates aren't taking place, that suggests that not much will happen immediately.
Yeah, no, very good. That's a good kind of reflection. I saw that piece, and I think the headline was broadening and deepening. And when I read it, I saw lots of broadening, not so much deepening. And I think Joe's point is, for GM, it's about deepening, not necessarily broadening. It's getting deeper into some of those issues and those services that you've got some control over, but need more over to really make the meaningful change that you want to bring about. Jill, final thought from you. Optimism around the white paper. You've kind of been on the inside, you've been on the outside. Are we all going to be super pleased and happy when we get to the white paper?
Depends what you want to see, but I mean, I think I would be looking at the spending review every bit as much as I'm looking at the white paper, because actually the spending review is where the government has to make decisions, or the announcements that flow out of that afterwards. But when we see those allocations, I noticed, Andrew, that almost everything you've got on the Centre for Cities website says you've got to restore sort of local government funding and stuff like that.
Yeah. That ain't gonna happen, is it?
Nice try, I would say.
Yeah.
But I think,
so
I think that's going to be
me being optimistic, Jill. This is me being optimistic.
But actually, when you look at the where money is going, does that show a commitment to levelling up whatever the white paper has said it means? I think that's the really interesting thing. Or do we just get some tokenism? So I think that's the acid test of the government putting its money where its mouth might be.
And it does bring to to full circle that sort of point around, on the one hand, a capital investment in something in a place, whilst public services funding is essentially being held constant or indeed reduced, seems to me to be a fundamental problem with really making levelling up more meaningful than some of the slogans that we've got thus far. It's 12 o'clock. We could go on, really could, but we unfortunately cannot. As I said, you'll find a recording of the event and all our work related to levelling up, all our optimistic desires for local government funding on our website, sandfordcities.org. As always, my huge thanks to Mark and to Joe and to Jill for making the time to be with us, but also for your brilliant insights and comments. And thank you all for joining, asking your questions. The final event in this series is next week. I think it's a week today, September the 21st, and it will be on the public perception. So we're going to have Kelly Beaver from Ipsos Mori, who's done lots of work on this, who's going to talk to us about where the public is on levelling up and what that might mean then for government and for politicians as we move forward. So hopefully details on our website, hopefully we'll see you again at that. But until then, take care and stay safe. And thanks again to my speakers. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Bye-bye.